Estamos al aire.
Bueno, bienvenidos al simposio. Bienvenidos al simposio internacional Voces desde el comienzo. Una visión global del arte temprano, humano, temprano. Estamos muy contentos con la acogida global que ha tenido el simposio. Creo que es una oportunidad increíble para reflexionar y poner en contexto, en un contexto global, la riqueza del arte rupestre de la Amazonía. Bueno, ante todo quería hacer dos aclaraciones a los participantes que nos están escuchando.
I wanted to thank everybody through Zoom. The first thing is that we have simultaneous translation to English and Portuguese and to Spanish. And in the icon, you can select the icon interpretation, which is the bottom right part of your screen. You may select your language. The second thing is that you can ask us questions to the Q&A icon that it's also there in the lower part of your screen. And that's why we are going to give the word to Nicolas Loaiza, who is the General Director of ICANN, so that he can continue with the opening of the event. Okay, thank you so much. I would like to welcome you to this Voices from the Beginning, Somfanium Global Vision of Early Human Art. I would like to welcome you we are so happy of being able to have you here for so long. And this has technical implications, and I think we're still learning. Therefore, I would like to thank the technical team that it's part of the communication team, Sophie Khan at the English link with the translator that are going to be here with us in the event and are going to help us with simultaneous translation that are so necessary for this global scale events. I would also like to thank the collaboration between Last Journey that it's funded by the European ERC, and also the ICANN, the Colombian Institute of Archaeology, the Exeter University and Universidad Nacional de Colombia has allowed to organize this event that we're going to have for these 2 days. The event will gather experts in cave paintings, as well as contemporary Amazonic art that will analyze from different perspectives the global development of humankind through our artistic expression. Cave art, it's a window towards the first artistic expressions of humankind. In many parts are cave art expresses way in which the people from the past navigated and understood their place in the world. It also happens currently. That's why these expressions have a very specific temporary scale that goes through different timelines. These are local expressions that represent very specific cosmology and also their own cultural development of whoever did that. The organizers with this event, we would like to find spaces for open discussion that we hope they continue in time, and also set the global discussion of cave painting of the Amazonian, especially in the Serranía de Lindosa and the Department of Guaviare in Colombia. It's worth highlighting that this mountain range, it's part of the buffering area of the Parque Chiribiquete, which is the only place well known that it's a mixed patrimony of the UNESCO in the Colombian territory, and there are only 3.5% of the places of the list have a mixed characteristic. Chiribiquete in particular has, because it has cultural values and also archaeological as well as natural art. In this denomination file of Chiribiquete as a World Heritage before the UNESCO, we had the Lindosa as the buffering area. What does this mean? It means that this is an area where we allow that it can be visited and that has some values that are very similar or equivalent to the ones of Chiribiquete and being part of the macro region. The idea is that they allow us to the cultural enjoyment, and also that we would like to move on with the scientific research in these areas. Lindosa was considered a protected archaeological area in the national territory through the Decree 120 of 2018 of the Colombian Institute of Archaeology and History. In total, there are 8 polygons that add up to 712 hectares. 668 hectares are area of direct influence and 534 are indirect influence area. There, from the natural and geological part, it's incredible to be able to observe that the Buyos, which are geological formations that are part of the region that we can find in Chiribiquete and also in Roraima and Venezuela, and that also part of the Shield de la Lindosa has one of the earliest human occupation evidence area in Colombia, north part of South America, and they're close to 12,000 years old. And I think that last journey, it's going to tell us about the research that they did there, which were able to conclude that the panels of cave art in Lindosa are huge, with expressions of fauna, flora, and also exceptional human figures that are exceptional at the national, international level. The paintings were done with local minerals as iron oxide that were obtained and prepared by the populations for these purposes, or that's our hypothesis, and that's the general hypothesis. And that is something that we would like to explore, and maybe the future research will shed some light on this topic. In general, what it's possible to overfly the Lindosa, and we can able to see the scenic beauty of which is different to the touristic flight in the Serranía de Chiribiquete. It's very important to clarify this, because for us, it's clear to understand that the important thing of Chiribiquete is to see it, because this can bring negative consequences for the indigenous communities that live there in voluntary isolation. And this agrees with the Decree 1273 of 2008 of the Ministry of Iranian Interior that protects those populations. Therefore, we all have to be aware of this topic. And the purpose of going to visiting La Lindosa, it's not just to identify the importance of the natural and cultural value of this region, but we also need to know in a very direct manner what are the threats that exist over this patrimony, and also to be able to contribute with direct actions. Deforestations and climate and changes in soil use can lead to the loss of cultural values in the mountain range, and this it generates the fires that can affect cave paintings and deteriorates them. It's very important that we continue working with different territorial entities, the state and the community in general. It's to say together to be able to find things that protected the area and that ensure the sustainability of this local and world patrimony on the long term. ICANN has been working the management and protection area in the protected management area in Ape, Lindosa mountain range, with the support of local and international organizations. Amongst the projects that we've developed and the last things that we've done, it's the load capacity of the polygons which are open, and also the signaling of the different journeys to regulate the visits and avoid a deterioration. That's why we want that the number of visitors in a time that it's determined for each of the panels, it's restricted, and in this way we reduce the deterioration. And also ICANN has been able to do preservation, including the diagnosis of deteriorations, to being able to generate a preservation plan, and also working in areas that have anthropic involvement. The incidence wants to coordinate policies and actions with different regional local entities in the territorial and cultural level, with the idea to work things in a jointly manner and to protect the ecological patrimony, and also to work with all the other contexts. We also, with the idea, it's to organize cultural tourism in the area, and that we want for that cultural enjoyment also protects the archaeological patrimony. It's very important to highlight that although we have 8 polygons that are considered a protected archaeological area, the cave art expressions in Guaviare and other parts are not just restricted to these areas. There is evidence of cave arts in petroglyph hieroglyphics in different areas of La Lindosa and the department as well as the country in general. And we are certain that there are several other things to be found, several other artistic expressions to be found, although La Lindosa and Chiribiquete, as well as many other places that have cave art in the countries, represent a very important moment of human occupations in Colombia because of the techniques for archaeological depth, the iconography, and the interpretations over its different meanings, and the way within in its place in the indigenous thought of processes. This is things that we can still need to study and learn, and that need to be explored and discussed. That's why we celebrate having spaces like this for this purpose. The nature of these expressions come from historical and local cultural process. That's why we in the Institute don't like the denomination of the 16th Chapel of South America upon many other denominations that we have given to the cave art of the northeastern part of the Amazonian region, because the value of these expressions and other human artistic expressions are in itself, and they don't need to be compared with other artistic expressions of other places. We do hope that this and many other points are discussed in these 2 days of the International Symposium, Voices from the Beginning, which is an early vision of early human art. And that's why we hope that it's the first of many spaces, and that's why we have this, and also its place in human development. And welcome. Okay, thank you so much, Nicolas, for your for such a wonderful presentation, calling for more ample discussion over all these topics. Now we are going to have an introduction to the last journey, and to the early cave art in the world. Above all, on behalf of the team of Last Journey, I would like to thank ICANN and their team, their communication team, for their help in the presentation and in the organization of this symposium. We would also like, in a very specific manner, to thank the communities and the ways of the sector of La Lindosa, where we have continued with our project because of their warming welcoming during our field projects. And this is something that we wanted to do in person in San Jose de Guaviare, but because of this pandemic, we had to do it virtually. But we do hope that next year this can be done in the region, and that we can go and visit the sites. Okay, I cannot. I can't see my presentation. Okay, this is our project Last Journey. It's focused on seeing the dissemination of modern humans in the last unknown continental area where these first humans arrived, South America. The modern humans, as you know, evolved in Africa more 200,000 years ago, and more or less 70,000, 60,000 years ago, they started to migrate around the 6 continents, and they explored Asia. They got to Australia more or less 50,000 years ago. And in the area that we're going to cover tomorrow, we can see that they came to the Americas 20,000 to 50,000 years ago. The population of the Americas is one of the biggest research topics in archaeology, and there's still a lot of controversy regarding and when did they arrive and what were the ways, the routes that these migrants took. And one of the most important historical events of humankind during this period, there was an unprecedented process of the dispersion of human groups in a high diversity of empty landscapes that happened during a lot of environmental changes at the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the interglacier that we are going through, the Holocene, changes in the subsistence of the groups. They moved on from hunters to start to grow crops and produce food, as well as there was the extinction of the big mammals of the Ice Age, and they started to work with plants. This is one of the events that we called a hot event in the history of humankind. And of course, in a very important manner, this group of factors also led to that diversification of groups that came from South America and that we can see nowadays. Okay, as you can see, this is not a problem that it's easy to approach and to resolve, and it can't be just answered by one single discipline. That's why, to be able to approach the population of the Americas and also of the northeastern part of South America, what we call Colombia, and we've created a multidisciplinary international team that, as you can see, it includes archaeology, archaeobotanic, zooarchaeology, the paleoclimate to rebuild weather, and also the analysis of the isotopes and also the bones of the megafauna, as well as environmental old DNA. During the global journey of our predecessor to paint and crave things in rocks, helped these pioneers to make landscapes much more human, to signal, to highlight those unknown territories, and also to stamp their identity in these new territories. The representations of the big mammals in cave art show the essential relationship between the first humans and megafauna during the global human expansions. Today's speakers are going to tell us about these topics in Asia, in Africa, and in Europe. And the population of South America was not exception, and the last areas of Ice Age shows us a lot of images of animals as guanacos, bears, extinct felines, as well as geometrical designs, and a lot of handprints. Tomorrow I will show you all the researchers that are doing these events in the different parts of South America. We're going to start in Colombia, where we have 4 presenters, and then we're going to go to the lower part of the Amazon. Then we're going to go through the mountain ranges of central Brazil, the northeastern part of Argentina, and finally the Patagonia. The Colombian Amazonian region is one of the richest parts in cave art in South America and in the world, and it's one of those places where the first Americans left their prints. Tomorrow, we're going to see the results of our project. We're going to show them along with Javier Aceituno, and we will have the pleasure to be able to listen to Carlos Castaño Uribe talking about Chiribiquete, and Fernando Urbina is going to talk about the mountain range of Lindosa, and Natalia Lozada, along with Jose Olivier, are going to talk to us about cave paintings in the northeastern part of Ichada. And as part of this region of the Colombian Amazonian region, as mentioned by Nicolas, that La Lindosa mountain range is 13 kilometers of straight walls that were like a huge canvas for thousands of cave paintings. Our team has been doing excavations in the region, and next I'm going to give the word to Gaspar Morcote Rios so that he sums up the results of our research. And therefore, I'm going to give the floor to you, Gaspar.
Gaspar.
Buenos días.
Recién lo habías compartido bien, Gaspar.
Ok, Gaspar.
Okay. Gracias. Ahí está.
Sí, ahora está. Perfecto.
Bueno, buenos días a todos.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to the colleagues that have accepted. Thank you so much to everybody that is connected. And we are going to talk about the voices from the beginning. And here I'm going to show you all the developments that we've done in many places, in 4 different places, old places that are in La Lindosa here in Guaviare. These are Cerro Azul, Seso Montañas, and Cerro Valladejo. And I'm going to talk in a much more specific part to one of them. And this is our team. This is our core team that has done this project. Okay, the Colombian Amazonian regions and all the context, all the Amazonic basin has few places that show presence of humans. We have 2. One is in Araraquara, and more specifically, and Villa Peñarroja, and the other ones that are here in what I call La Lindosa. The Lindosa mountain range. In these 2 places, we have found remains of fauna, flora, and we have also found evidence of seeds and fruits and some microscopic structures that are produced by plants that when they die, they can remain in the soil for years, and they're called phytolites. That's why in these same places we have found hundreds of artifacts, and that of course an essential idea that are mineral pigments and that all these kinds of evidence, and that the sites in La Lindosa, it's where we are working, and they are associated to this hundreds of iconographs. These human settlements in the Colombian region, their earliest dates are 12,600 years before our time. We are going to check out the physiography and the climate of La Lindosa in a very general manner. We are here in an area that has a high, there's a lot of rainfall. We think that it has 2,800 millimeters of rain a year. The temperatures are between 29 and 30 degrees. And this area, it's characterized because it has some rocks that we consider that it can be between 2,500 and 750 million years of age. And that's why they have areas that have 2 million years. And there is an area that La Lindosa, it's an area that has, that's an area where elements of the flora, elements of fauna, both from the Amazon and as well as from the Orinoquia merge. That's why this is essential, because the two areas merge. And that's why in the area we have the Guayabero River that later, that when they then merges with the Ariari, it gets the Ariari, and this goes to the Orinoco River. This affluent goes to the Orinoco River. That's why we also have to highlight some areas in El Guayabero that it's the presence of these areas that are important, and also for the old populations are strategic, and both for fishing and also for the control of the history. Okay, when we go to La Lindosa, in this area where we are working, what do we find? What's the ecological evidence that we can find? In Guayabero, we can find petroglyphs. We can also find some evidence that are being researched, that are the black soil here in La Lindosa, that are some technology. And we also find all these panels of pictographies that are associated to old settlements. The area that we're going to present today are from four different places, data from 4 places, but I'm going to emphasize the one where we've advanced the most, which is Cerro Azul. And therefore, we're going to talk about that. From 2014 until 2021, we have done all kinds of prospective studies, archaeological excavations, and we've also done lab analysis. This lab analysis have different parts. One is we study lithics with the tool instruments that are preserved in these places. And we also have the paleontological studies that we take into account the different seeds that we can find along with the phytoliths. It gives us a very good paleobotanic study that it's associated to the human groups. Likewise, we did, and this was something that was done by one of our students, Jason Chaparro. He did an archaeophonic study where we keep on exploring this study, and also we are working with dating and soil studies. Here we can see the different stages for the prospective studies and the excavations in the field done by our team. In this area, we've done few systematic excavations, and the first one took place in 1989, and it was published in 1990. Then later on, we have been published all the developments that have taken place in these excavations in this publication from 2017. And also this recent publication of Quaternary International, it's where we see the latest development of our research. Okay, this is some of the stratigraphication of Cerro Azul. This stratigraphication, it's complex, but in this type, in each of these strata, and we can see that from very early, it's been an occupation of this place. We're going back to 12,300 years in Cerro Azul, and from there until more or less 300 years ago, we are evidencing the human presence. Therefore, throughout all the excavations, through all the different strata, there was a continuous occupation of the site. Okay, here we can see the data that we use with carbon-14, that in all the places that we are investigating, we can see that the earliest occupation was 12,612 and 12,100 for the place of Limoncillos, and 1,200 for Cerro Azul. And therefore, that's the occupation associated to human activities that up to date we have in record. Of course, there are earlier dates, but if we associate, we cannot yet associate them to human activities. Our association, it's more in this period of the 12,600, 12,100 years with human activities in these areas of La Lindosa. It's very important. This place, it's very important because there are few places in all the Amazonic basin that are so old. One of them it's located in the lower Amazonian region. Here in this place, it's known as Caverna da Pedra Pintada, that tomorrow they will talk to us about this beautiful place. And the other place that it's over here where we're talking about La Serranía de la Landosa, that it's 12,600 years old. Here in the lower Amazonian region, we are talking about human occupation that goes back 13,000 years. That's why it is so important to see these places, because there are few places, and with these few places, we are evidencing that there is an understanding of how the Amazon basin was occupied. There were some events, and throughout these places, we're getting to know other places in the Amazon region. We're getting to know essential events, cultural events that took place in the Amazon basin. And over here in La Lindosa, along with Carnaverna de Altaverna, it's talking to us about a human presence, about human activities that go back 13,000 years, that have the management of palms, of nuts, and 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 that continued with the extension of megafauna. And back in the year 10,000, we can see farming, we can see the cropping, the use of plants and the vegetables as doscorias, as pumpkin, or also yam. And later, and also, but later on, 6,000 years ago, we can see corn, the dispersion of corn, and also the technology throughout the year 6,000. And something essential that we can see in the Amazon basin in the 6,000 years ago, it's those technologies, these black soil technologies, and we can see them over here. And we can also see later on the taming probably of the duck, the taming of cocoa, and of something of a grain that is very similar to rice. Many events, many cultural events, it's because the Amazon, in the Amazon, there have been thousands of events, and all these events and many cultural process that we have seen were affected by the European culture. And we can see that our excavations, we have found this type of tools that talk to us about the manipulations of the processing of fish, of fauna, and also of corn. One element that we have to take into account. It's that in the excavations and also since the beginning of human occupation, we have seen hundreds of fragments of mineral pigments, Frank. We have seen thousands, and these mineral pigments are local, have a local origin. We can see that they can be found very close to the areas where we did the excavations. And here we can see some of the pigments that have geometrical sides, and you can see that they have prints. That probably it's because of that direct use at the moment of doing these sculptures. Right, also in these places, we have found hundreds of seeds and fruits that have expanded how these first groups survived, and allowing us to see that the palms were a group that was highly appreciated by these first settlers, and also how the use of fruits and tubercules played a very important role in these first groups of La Lindosa mountain range. And following the same line, other types of analysis are those petrolites, microscopic silica. We can see that the palms played a very important role along with tubercules. Here we can see these structures that we can see in the place. And these are some of the species of some of the species of plants that the first groups and later on the farming groups of the Amazon and of La Lindosa are selecting. But the essential thing is that the palms groups, and because there's a high diversity of palms, are being manipulated and are being managed since the early ages. But not only the palms played a very important role as food and also for their served other type of purposes, but also we have the symbolic element of the palms. And over here we can see how the palms are represented, one in some pictographies of Chiribiquete and in some pictography of Atei. And therefore they can tell us that these first human groups, you probably had a high appreciation or symbolical appreciation for these species. Okay, regarding the archaeological fauna, we have found several groups within in the archaeological context. We have mammals with 4 taxons, and extels and has, and we can in gasteropods we can see that all this fauna, it's being used by all these Amazonic groups. And we can see all these evidence of the bones of these species. We have armadillo, we have the boa, we have the jacareo, we have the alligator, we have what we call here in Colombia jaque. And amongst the fish, we have one that is present in the archaeological context, which is the piranhas. This is a part of the group of animals that the earliest groups are selecting for different purposes, and also for food. And to finish up, and we are going to make some comments. First, it's that in La Lindosa, there was a colonization that goes back like 13,000 years. And an element, it's something that we must continue studying. It's how was the colonization of this area? Was it El Oronico, maybe going up the Amazon River? Maybe these groups were coming down the Andes. These were questions that we are asking ourselves, and as we can gather more data, we are able to answer these questions. data are telling us that there's an emphasis in fishing and in hunting of mammals. Something that we are concluding is that humans have been key in the abundance and the distributions of useful plants. And in the tropical areas, palms are a key group to understand the influence of humans and the composition of the forests. And also, as a conclusion, we can see that mosaic of pictographies that today we have in La Lindosa mountain range. It has been there since the beginning of human occupation in this site. It's to say 13,000 years ago, and that this activity of drawing was preserved until only 100 years back. I would like to thank because this project wouldn't be possible and one doesn't have the collaboration of the people in the area, of the community. That's why I would like to thank them for their help, for their support, and also are the different institutions where we can work, the professors and also the funders. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Many thanks, Gaspar, for your presentation. Quite illustrative about this first human beings that arrived to the Colombian Amazonia. Now, we are going to travel from the Amazonia, we're going to leave the Colombian Amazonia, and we are going to start this journey talking about global prehistoric art. So in this respect, I'm going to invite Andres Rozwadowski from the archaeology faculty in Poznan, in Poland, so that he can introduce his work about prehistoric art in Siberia, prehistoric artists and modern artists. So welcome, Andres. And I leave you, the floor is yours, so that you can tell us about the prehistoric and modern artists, rock art in Siberia.
Okay, thank you very much. I just
Muchas gracias.
I try to arrange this presentation. Just one moment. Where it's. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting us to give this presentation. We'll give you the short introduction to the prehistoric art in Siberia, and our presentation is titled "Rock Art in Siberia: Prehistoric and Modern Artists." My name is Andrzej Rozwadowski. I work at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. And the second speaker is Elena Miklaszewicz. She works in Institute of Archaeology, Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. And Elena is also working in Tomskaya Pisanica Museum Reserve in Kemerovo, which is actually in Siberia. Oops. Okay, when we talk about Siberia, we need to say that the forest, it's actually the vast territory. It's a vast territory which stretches from the west, from the Ural Mountains, to the east to the Pacific Ocean, and from the north from the Arctic Ocean to the south to the borders with Kazakhstan, China, and Mongolia. Siberia is also diverse from geographical point of view, and we have the mountains. Here we have also the steppe area, which is maybe a bit surprising. You can see this beautiful picture of the steppe, but this area is also very important from the point of our cultural processes, which were present in prehistoric and historic times in Siberia. The central part of the Siberia is the area where you can find the forest, so the taiga, and in the north there is tundra. Of course, the main concentrations of rock art, both painted and engraved images, can be found in the area where are mountains. This is quite obvious, and the more to the north, when we go to the north, the natural places where rock art can be found are the valleys, the corridors of big rivers, which are surrounded by big cliffs, which provide beautiful canvases for making images on them. And rock art is present in almost every part of Siberia. It could be impossible to talk and to present, to characterize this rock art just in very short presentation. So we will focus our attention just on a few areas which we know the best from our personal research, and we believe that this conclusion will be also relevant for general understanding of tradition of making images on rocks in Siberia. The first question that usually people ask when we talk about any art tradition in any part of the world, of course, is how old the tradition is. And actually, the art tradition in Siberia starts very early in Upper Paleolithic, but this is not; these are not images on rocks. This is what we, as archaeologists, call mobile art, and we have quite a lot and beautiful pieces with images, for example, the Pleistocene fauna like mammoths, which were engraved on the pieces of bone or ivory. We have also images, we have also small sculptures of birds, of water birds. Also the pieces of bones, which are sophisticatedly engraved with sophisticated designs, probably symbolic. And we have also the images, the sculptures, ivory and stone and bone sculptures of human figures. So in this case, particularly female figurines. When we come to rock art, we can say that we don't have in Siberia art which was created in deep caves. However, we have some similarities with the whole Eurasian Paleolithic context, because the first element is the female figurines, and we can say that the Siberia was not separated from the wider cultural trends which were present in Paleolithic times on the vast areas between Europe and Asia. And when we approach Siberia, there are Ural Mountains, and in Ural Mountains there are at least two well-known caves with Paleolithic paintings. These are Ignatievska and Kapova caves. The paintings are generally estimated to be between 15,000 years old, but new research shows that the older age cannot be excluded. So in the proper Siberia, we don't have the sites with rock art in deep caves, with one exception or several small exceptions. They are not deep caves, but generally we would like to draw your attention to one site, which is in Western Mongolia. This is actually a small cave, Hoint Tsenherui Agui, where there are different paintings, and among them there is also representation of the animal, which quite possibly is the depiction of mammoth. This identification was questioned and was hotly debated in scholarly discussion, But what it appears that also in open landscape, the new research shows that there are also images which quite possibly can be interpreted as depictions of mammoths. And what is furthermore interesting, that in this part of Asia, in the Altai, both in Mongolian part and Russian part of Altai, there are also images, engraved images of horses, white horses and white bulls, which show striking similarities from stylistic point of view to images which we know very well from Western Paleolithic cave art. And this is particularly interesting that new research further in other parts of Siberia also demonstrate that not only in Mongolia, but also in other parts of Siberia. Here we are in here we are in the upper Yenisei River in the territory of Republic of Khakassia, and there are also recently discovered images, or there are still they have been still discovered of images of animals which are most probably images of extinct fauna. So generally speaking, the Paleolithic phenomena probably is not only limited to mobile art, it's quite possible that petroglyphs and images, general images on rocks were also have been done as early as the Upper Paleolithic. But of course, there's still the problem, which will be investigated probably thoroughly in future, because there was no application direct datings in Siberia, so there was still huge possibility for discussing this question. So thanks to archaeological remains from other periods, we can reconstruct the art traditions almost to the historical times. And the earliest strata, the oldest paintings and engravings, which are associated with the Stone Age, are still a little bit enigmatic context if in Siberian rock art. When we thanks to this possibility that we are here, we'd like to draw your attention also to one site, which is called Tomska Pisanica. And this is because this is actually the only one site which is a cultural reserve museum in Siberia. Although there was there was a huge number of sites with rock art in Siberia. Actually, there's only the one which is fully protected. But it's also fascinating that it was discovered exactly 300 years ago in 1721 by German explorer Daniel Gottlieb Messerschmitt. And this site is still explored. It's the place also where my co-speaker Elena Miklaszewicz is working. And this site includes beautiful engraved and exceptionally polished images of elks, moose, and another feature of this art, which is probably associated with the Neolithic times, there are also human figures, and the appearance of human figures in the tradition of Siberian rock art signals new stage of the art development in Siberia. And actually, the humans start to be dominating feature of rock art in the Bronze Age, which is generally speaking the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC. And the human figures are in different associations, in different forms. You can see here beautiful engraved composition of human figures in dynamic positions, probably maybe dancing. And also the characteristic feature of this art from this time is also the images. There are also images of animals which also do not represent quite often the realistic animals. There are some strange animals, there are some strange associations of figures which include elements of human and animal features. So you can see the different examples, some examples of how human figures are, for example, associated with animal worlds. There is not too many representations of hunting. There is some kind of more symbolic probably relations, and there is also fascinating images of female figures, most probably, although this is still a little bit discussion about this, but the world is really changing. There is something, there is some kind of interrelationship between human world and animal world, and we can see this not only in the images which were made on rocks, but also on the among the images which were included, which were part of burial context. And this is one of very special, very exceptional site. This is Karakol in the Altai, in central Altai mountains in south of Siberia. And on the slabs, there are many engraved and painted images. You can see here just a sample of one of the slabs. There are human figures which are partly human, but are partly animal. So this is also the feature which characterize other forms of art in Siberia from this time. And maybe one of the most spectacular are stone stelas, which we can see here, and there's a historical photograph from the beginning of 20th century. These are really monumental sculptures, which were also decorated, but different images. And from burial context, we know we have also other images. You can see there's a fantastic beasts, like creatures from another world. So there's a full of elements which enable us to think about this art as representations of some kind of culture, new way of thinking. Some people would say, some researchers argue that maybe we have the beginning, so this art signals the beginning of some kind of narratives which maybe develop into storytelling tradition, which actually the storytelling is very important in many nations, or all nations, indigenous people in Siberia, and this storytelling tradition is very important till the present. The big change appeared in the first millennium BC. It was connected with the development of new cultural style and economy. There's related to early nomadic society, horse riding societies. And these early nomads were very much fascinated with animalistic world. And the animals started to be the key, very important symbols. And particularly significant was the deer, and the deer or different element or similar animals which can be related to deer. And we can see these images on the rocks. The images were also presented on the stone stela. And you can see that the standing stones were like embodiments of humans, and they were engraved of images of animals, very often just with deer. And we know from very well preserved mummified bodies in the kurgans or the barrows that these white animals were also presented in the form of tattoo on the body of buried humans. So it's quite possible that this deer particularly was some kind of animal, the passage, which was the link between this world and another world, between humans and animals. So generally speaking, between human world and the spiritual world. So when we talk about Siberia from cultural point of view, it's quite often that we are referring to shamanism, and actually shamanism is very important and very crucial element of indigenous culture tradition, indigenous culture. And you can see the schematic map, which shows that in every part of Siberia, shamanism is known, shamanism is practiced. So this is some kind of window into investigation of the meaning and symbolic sphere dimension of the prehistoric rock art. But what is particularly interesting and a bit surprising even, that we don't have too many images of shamans in rock art, and these images, which can be identified as a clear representations of shamans, actually appear to be not very old, rather from historical times. And we would like to show you just two examples. One is from North Siberia and the second will be from the south. Here we are in the North Siberia, in the area of Olenyok River. And on this big cliff, you can find just two paintings representing shamans. But this site is very interesting from the symbolic landscape as well, because there's a river, Olenyok River, and when you cross the river, you enter the forest, the taiga, and in the taiga there are spectacular tombs, burials of shamans. This is very unique photo showing just the burial of the tomb of a shaman. And the symbolic context is interesting because we know from Siberian cosmologies and Siberian beliefs that the river is an element which is the link between the past, the present, is the link between the ancestor and the present culture, between the living beings and the spiritual world. So crossing the river is also analogous to the crossing to the other world. So looking at these paintings, it's also interesting to look at them from the perspective of this Siberian cosmology, which is some kind of window to understand not only the images but general culture and landscape context. The second example comes from Altai, from the south Siberia, and this is also characteristic for many images of shamans, which is also surprising because, as you can see, the images are very small in size. And when you approach the site, for example, we are approaching here the mountain, the rock with the images are just over here. We are closer and closer, and only if you are face to face with the rock, you can notice the engraved images, which are clearly, definedly images of shamans. And this is maybe connected with theory according to which the images of shamans were mostly made in historical times, and it's possible, some researchers argue, that they were made during the time when the colonization process started. So here, actually, you may have impression that the images are engraved in the places to be hidden, not to be seen by other people. So it's maybe connected with this process which I just mentioned. But we believe that shamanism, although there are not direct representation of shamans in much older rock art, we believe that some ideas connected with the shamanistic beliefs, perception of the world, also be discovered and detected in prehistoric rock art. And here you can see the logic which can be used for investigation of some kind of decoding, some kind of symbolic pattern of shamanism. We have a drum, shamanic drum. And actually, the representation of shamanic drums are not present in very old and prehistoric rock art. But what is particularly significant, the drum is an animated object. So there's a horse. The horse is sacrificed. From the sacrificed horse, from the skin of the sacrificed horse, the drum is constructed. The drum is undergoing special ceremony, ritual ceremony of animation. and the drum becomes an animal. And on this drum, exactly as an animal, the shaman is riding, using the drum, the shaman is riding on the drum like an animal to other worlds. So this is one example showing what kind of logic we can use also to investigate older meanings, the shamanic meanings in older prehistoric rock art. When we talk about this cultural tradition, which is very important for Siberian indigenous people, we need to emphasize that shamanism in Siberia, it's not just ritual ecstasy, technique of ritual ecstasy. It's an indigenous religion. It's a source of cultural identity. And for many indigenous people, they say that shamanism for them is just a religion. It's not just a technique which can be present and used in different parts of the world. So the perception of shamanism is a bit different from the scholarly discourse in Western science. And you can see there just two photographs from the ceremony of Isych in Yakutia Sakha Republic in eastern Siberia. The shaman is participating, and all the people are gathering in the evening. They are dancing, they are singing all the night, waiting for the sun. And in the morning, when the sun is rising, they put their hands and they catch the energy, the power from the sun. They take it, and this is some kind of very strong experience for many people, which is somehow connected with the idea of shamanism. Unfortunately, there is no continuation of tradition of image making in Siberia, and there is no ethnographical data in which we could find information about, from historical times, about informations about making images on rocks. But there is a very interesting phenomenon in contemporary Siberia, and it concerns contemporary art, in which modern artists quite often they draw upon the prehistoric imagery, prehistoric rock art, and also the spiritual legacy, and especially shamanism. And you can see the young artist Arjan Yuteyev from Gorno-Altaysk, and in this one of his works you can see the images from rock art, and also the face of shaman, and the shaman is holding the drum. The references to the past imagery and shamanism can be found also in the art of other indigenous artists. We are here in Khakassia, in the south of Siberia, and you can see just the works of two artists, Alexei Ulturgashev and Alexander Domozhakov, and you can see there's a rock engraving from Khakassia, and this engraving, this probably historic from early historic times engraving was the inspiration for Alexander Domozhakov to paint at least two these pictures. And this here is an example showing how on these prehistoric pieces of art, which can be seen in museum, Alexei Ulturgashev painted also another picture, which he called "Sacrifice to Gods." Unfortunately, Ulturgashev passed away just a couple of months ago. Many of the artists are referring also to the standing stones, to the stone stela, but why they are referring to these old monuments? This is one picture of Alexander Domozhakov, which you can see these images which are actually inspired by these prehistoric stone stelas. But why they are so important for the indigenous artists? Because they believe, and there is a shared belief in the tradition, that these objects are not just representations, are not just images from the past, are not simply archaeological objects, but from early ethno-historical sources, we know that such objects were worshipped. From the beginning of 20th century, we have even photographs showing the people who are interacting with the stela. They are feeding them. And one of the most famous is Hurtujahtas, the big stone old woman, which in Soviet times was moved from its original place and was taken to the museum. But what happened? That indigenous people were coming to the museum and they were worshipped. They were making offerings to this stone also in the museum. So finally, the stone was returned to this original place and it's still venerated, it's still worshipped. It's very important for society, for indigenous people. So when we see these images of the standing stones also in the art of contemporary artists, so we can understand that they are not just represent just archaeological monuments, but they represent the spiritual culture and the ancestors. So the art for them is some kind of dialogue with the ancestors, with the spirits, which are responsible for well-being of the society. The contemporary art, which draws on the prehistoric art, concerns not only the paintings, but also, for example, the big sculpture. And there is one of the example, the sculpture made by Dashin Namdakov, which is called Gold Shoria. It's situated in Gornaya Shoria. It's the land which is inhabited by the people who are called Shors. There's indigenous nation in Siberia. And you can see the big horns of the elk, which are decorated by the images, which are inspired by the petroglyphs from Mongolia. And this is interesting to note that Dashin Namdakov originates from Buryat society, and Buryat people are speaking Mongolian language. So Dashin Namdakov, in his works of art, is making references to the prehistory, basing on linguistic references of his ancestry to the area from which the petroglyphs come. So the Mongolian land and the Mongolian language are interacted. So in this very short presentation, we wanted to show you just, to offer you just a glimpse into Siberia from the perspective of rock art. And what's the final conclusion? That this prehistoric rock art in Siberia is important not only from scientific and archaeological point of view, it's not significant not only for reconstructing archaeological processes, but starts to be, particularly at this moment, to be important also for indigenous societies. And this prehistoric art significantly influences ongoing cultural processes. So this is our final conclusion. We would like to thank also some institutions and persons who help us to do this research and supported our presentations. So thank you very much. I hope it was very short, but a little bit information was useful. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Andre. Yes, in fact, has been a very useful, informative outlook about prehistoric art in Siberia. And let me tell you that we have several questions about it. So I'm going to ask you to be with us at the end of our let's say workshop, to transmit you the questions we have from our audience so that you can reply them. Now, from Siberia, we are going to South Africa. Professor David Prix. We're going to talk about prehistoric art of gatherers in South Africa. view from the world of these people. So welcome, David, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today giving this presentation and talking about Africa, wherever the people first came from. Very different, I think, from South America, where one of the later places that the people populate. Africa is obviously a vast continent with many diverse peoples and rock art traditions. That are visually different, that were made for different reasons, and have different meanings. And I obviously can't talk about all of this. Indeed, I'm going to be able to only touch the surface in showing you something of the hunter-gatherer rock art in South Africa, right down in the south of the continent. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the rock art in the Drakensberg mountain range. But I assure you there's more than enough there to keep us occupied for the next 20 minutes. So we zoom in a little bit to South Africa here. The Drakensberg mountain range forms the eastern escarpment of the country. There's art all over the place, so I'm just going to focus in on the Drakensberg, and particularly down in the southern part of the range here, where I do most of my work. The area looks something like that. We have these lower mountains in the foreground here, and then higher mountains up in the background here, decorated with a little bit of snow. It's mostly in these lower mountains that we find the rock art sites, and you see these various exposures of rock, and it's in these rocky bands that we find the rock shelters in which the paintings are found. In fact, there's a little painted site right here in this gully in front of us, and there's a much larger, more significant site off to the right here. The art in the Drakensberg is both very beautiful and very detailed. This is a panel from a site known as Storm Shelter. Give you a sense of the scale. This panel is about 6 meters long, and as you can see, there are a great many paintings in that panel. A number of different colors represented, a number of different subjects. There are about 230 individual paintings in here, about 5 layers of painting in the center here. As you can see, there are a great many different subjects depicted. A great many of these antelope throughout the site, the eland, a very, very common subject throughout the Drakensberg. You'll see a number of human figures here in white, here in a dark red. A couple of feline figures, one here, the end of one here. And there are a whole lot of other things we can't really see in this photo, but it's a very diverse, very detailed art. Despite the appearance in many big panels like this of a great many eland antelope, the most frequently depicted subject in the art is in fact human figures. And I just want to show you a couple of examples here, just to show you some of the diversity, because the human figures are painted in a wide range of different ways. These ones are in white and red. A lot of the white is very, very faint, so it's not entirely easy to see it. You can see the head of a figure here, the face, the lips there, the body in white here, the legs coming down, an arm here, and another arm here, holding a bow. A lot of detail on the face, a lot of detail on the legs. Another figure here, you see the head and the arms. There's a figure seated here, very faint in white, and another one here. We look at another site, a seated human figure. It has a bow across the shoulder, resting on something here, some sort of resonator most likely, and tapping the bowstring with the stick. So this is a figure playing a musical bow. Again, you can see a lot of detail in the head. You can see some of the facial features here, details of the hair, various things on the body. Another figure squats next to it and is clapping here. We also have, from the same site here, other detailed human-like figures here. Again, you can see the face, various facial features, all sorts of details of the hair, holding a stick, something slung over the shoulder, something wrapped around the body. But in this case, it has antelope legs rather than human legs, so something a bit different going on with this figure. besides all the realistic depictions of animals, there, eland, for example, that we see, there also are the non-realistic depictions of animals, such as this one here. There are in fact 3 of these, very large, heavy-bodied quadrupedal animal, doesn't resemble any real animal, has little dots all over it and many odd features. There's a smaller one beneath it here, and there's a third one above it that's mostly obscured now with mud from a swallow's nest. And of course, we do have the depictions of eland that I mentioned, and a great deal of attention and detail is lavished on these paintings. If you have a look at this figure, notice the horns, obviously, the ears, the red hair inside the ears, the red forelock, the eye in black, the nose in black, the mouth, a very narrow, maybe 1 millimeter wide painted line, the Adam's apple, the dewlap with hair on it, the line along the back showing the longer hair on the animal's back, the tail swept across the body here, the hooves and fetlocks in black. And then a very unusual characteristic of paintings in the Drakensberg, and particularly the paintings of eland, is the shading of the paint. So we get the darker, the red along the back of the animal, shaded down towards white on the belly, and also the shading showing the musculature and shaping of the animal. We're very fortunate in South Africa in knowing, not just having this astonishingly beautiful and detailed art, but in knowing something about it, indeed knowing quite a lot about it. And the reason we know about this art is because we have various ethnographic accounts that illuminate aspects of the art. We have only one direct account from a contemporary person describing rock art in the Drakensberg. This is a man by the name of King, who was a guide for a British colonial officer leading a punitive raid in what was at that time Basotho land. And they visited various rock art sites along the way, and King explained what was in them to the officer Joseph Orpen, who made copies of some of these paintings and later published those paintings along with King's explanations. Here you see his published copies. So those are the only direct accounts we have of rock paintings from a contemporary San person who knew something about the production of the art. We do, however, have a number of other ethnographic sources that are extremely useful in understanding the art. One of the most significant sources was collected by this man, Wilhelm Blake, and his sister-in-law Lucy Lloyd in the 1870s from Kam Bushman. This is Kabo, one of the informants that provided this information. But there are a number of other people as well who were talking to Blake and Lloyd about this. And Blake was interested primarily in the language, and the languages are complicated. These are click languages. There are 5 different clicks in the Southern San languages. So we had to invent a phonetic script to be able to write this all down. And he and Lloyd did indeed write down very extensive comments and accounts from these various people. This is one of the notebook pages from their records, and indeed an account from Kabo, the man I just showed you. And the way they did this is that in the left-hand columns here, they wrote down what the people were saying in the Kham language, and then they transliterated that into English in the right-hand columns. And the left-hand pages of the notebooks were reserved for additional notes and comments about the language or the stories or whatever it was that needed additional notes to be made. You'll note here that this is notebook page 8033. You'll also note that it's only the right-hand pages that are numbered. And altogether, there are 12,000 right-hand notebook pages in this collection in the original Kham language, providing a great deal of insight into the worldview and beliefs of these people. Now, one of the interesting facts is that the Joseph Orpen's copies that I showed you a moment ago were sent to Blake, and he showed his informants these copies also. So their comments on them also. But what's particularly astonishing is Blake's insights into this art based on these copies and his understanding of the calm worldview. He said of the art that it's an attempt, however imperfect, at a truly artistic conception of the ideas which most deeply moved the Bushman mind and filled it with religious feeling. Now, Blake, saying this in the 1870s, was certainly a man well ahead of his time. This certainly wasn't the prevailing view of Bushmen in colonial South Africa at that time. But Blake's prescient words were ignored for the better part of the next century. And it's only really changed in the 1970s with the work of David Willis-Williams, where he considered San ritual in some detail. And despite initial misgivings, it transpires that different ethnographies, these calm ethnographies that I've just spoken about, as well as more recent material from the Kalahari, showed very significant similarities. And these are not similarities in general terms, but similarities demonstrated in by point comparisons. And the similarities are particularly evident in areas of ritual and religion, whereas there are differences in other areas. Ritual and religion seems to be very, very standardized across many groups in many places. And the ritual that is particularly important for us in understanding this art is the trance dance. This is a photo taken from the Kalahari in the 1950s by the Marshall family, showing an example of this dance. And it gives you the general outline of the kinds of way this ritual proceeds. Women sit in the center and sing and clap medicine songs, the powerful songs, and then mostly men dance in a circular fashion around that group of women. It's a very slow, rhythmic dance moving around. And in the course of this dance, people adopt a number of distinctive postures, often bending forward at the waist, holding their arms out behind them, supporting their weight on sticks. They use distinctive equipment, often having rattles wrapped around their legs, carrying the sticks, as I mentioned, carrying fly whisks, and so on. The purpose of this dance is to people dance themselves. This would go on all night usually, and people would dance themselves into a trance state that is understood to be the spirit world. And in the spirit world, people undertake a number of different activities, from visiting God's house in the sky to visiting people in far-off places, seeing and controlling the movements of game, controlling the rain, and so forth, healing, of course. And in the process, people often transform into animal forms in the spirit world. Now, why this dance is so important is that we see depictions of this quite frequently in the rock art. We do see a few depictions like this one of the dance in the circular fashion, very much like we have in the ethnographic accounts. Figures in the center and a circle of people dancing around in these various distinctive postures. More frequently, we see these dances spread out in a line, as we see in this drawing. And this is a very, very nice example with many of the figures bending forward, many of the figures with their arms out backwards, a number of them with dancing sticks, a number of them bleeding from the nose, various of them with rattles around their legs, and so on. More frequently still, we see individual dancing figures in these distinct postures and with this distinctive equipment just scattered around in panels. As we see here, a figure bending forward very distinctly at the waist with these white dancing sticks and blood coming from the nose. But we don't just see depictions of this dance and dancers in the art, as we've seen in the earlier pictures, but we also see things that people do and see in the spirit world. So, for example, we see these transformed figures, as we saw a moment ago. These part human, part animal figures are fairly common in the art, either usually with antelope legs, as we see here, or with antelope heads. Many of these non-real animals that we see are again explicable in terms of what people say they see. These are almost certainly rain animals. The rain is conceived of as an animal that can be captured and taken to where you wish it to rain, where you then kill it, and its blood would come down as rain. And the descriptions of rain animals match these large quadrupedal animals very well. So certainly a number of these non-real things are very easily explained, as well as the dance postures. Some of the more real things, like the eland antelope, may be a little more difficult, because there are, of course, real eland antelope out there. But again, details from the ethnographies provide a lot of insight into eland. These are very important, very powerful animals within the worldview of the San, containing a great deal of a supernatural power that people could harness to perform a variety of different tasks. So that the presence of many paintings of eland in the art entirely makes sense. Having said all this, and this provides us just with a general background understanding to what this art is about. But we are just beginning to scratch the surface of both discovering and understanding this art. I know many people here today are interested in the antiquity of the art. In South Africa, as in most places, it's extremely difficult to directly date rock art, either paintings or engravings. That is why in so many places around the world, the chronology is not entirely clear with a lot of rock art. So this reason that I and my colleague Delphine Bonneau have been working for the past 10 years to develop rigorous techniques to directly date rock paintings in Southern Africa. Here you see a Delphine sampling some paint in one of the sites we're working in. I'm not going to go into detail about all of the work we've been doing with that, although I can see from some of the other presentations that there clearly are some similarities with the kinds of paint and pigment analysis work we've been doing. But suffice to say that the work we've been doing is hinged on very detailed characterization of the composition of both the paint and rock weathering products. And using this information, we've been able to extract clean black carbon from certain paintings and been able to AMS radiocarbon date it. Just here an example of some of the black carbons that we've been able to clean up out of these paints and date. We've now got 40-odd radiocarbon dates, mostly from the Maluti-Drakensberg range. The art in the region dates from at least 3,000 years ago to within the last few hundred years. And all the typical hunter-gatherer art dates from about 1,500 to 3,000 years ago. And the more recent dates relate to other types of art. This is obviously not all that old compared to the very long occupational sequence we have in the region. Of course, it's not a competition for oldness. Where things get especially interesting is where we look at multiple dates within a single painted panel. And why this is so interesting is that we can start to see something of the way in which panels build up. So if we look at this site, for example, we have 9 radiocarbon dates from various figures across this panel, and 6 on the panel itself and 3 on flakes that have fallen off. We start to see something of a pattern developing in how this panel is built up. And I must say it was certainly very unexpected when we modeled the dates coming from these paintings. We found that they fell out into 3 distinct phases. And more astonishing still, that those phases seem to move from left to right across the site, although not entirely consistently so. This is still a very few dates in a very large panel of many paintings. So I'm not confident that this necessarily built up entirely in this manner. But I think it's possibly something along the lines of which we can start to see as we start to look more at the chemistry and dating of these panels. We also have dates within a single panel 1,000 years apart from each other. Whilst we've always known that panels built up over time, as evident in looking at any of these large, dense panels, I don't think many of us realized quite how much time some of these built up over. More interesting still is that some paintings were added to existing groups and mimic those that were previously made. And this is something very different from the often held idea of changing styles of art over time. What we see here instead is a great deal of long-term conservatism and sameness in the art. We look at these two figures, for example. These are top halves of two human figures. The rest's unfortunately flaked off. And this is part of a line of human figures walking across the rock. And these two, painted very similarly looking next to each other, date to about 1,000 years apart. So over the 1,500 years or so which we have dated art in the Drakensberg so far, there's really little that shows any sort of stylistic difference amongst any of those paintings. All those that are clearly look different are made in the last few hundred years and are clearly related to contact with other groups. Something is a slightly different view there of how art is changing, or in this case not changing, over time. I think also very interesting though that whilst the art remains very conservative over time, people were interacting with that older art in very detailed ways over very long periods of time, adding in paintings that mimic others, as I've said. I think we're just beginning to unwrap the implications of the dating and paint chemistry work we're doing on this art. But I think even at this early stage, it's clear that it's beginning to show us things about the making and use of the art that go well beyond what we know from the ethnographies alone. And I'm confident that as we progress with this work, we'll start finding further understandings of how the art was made and used that we don't currently have. I hope in this very brief presentation I've been able to give you some idea of the Drakensberg hunter-gatherer rock art from South Africa, and I hope that's been of interest to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for such an interesting presentation. The truth is that it's amazing. And the realism and the sophistication of cave art that you have shown us. And we also think that it's extremely interesting the use of ethnographic analogies to be able to understand this art is something that's happening in the Colombian Amazon range. Once again, thank you so much in advance. I would like to take our attendees that we're going to take a break, a 10-minute break. And it's, if I'm not wrong, it's 10:36 in a.m. in Colombia, 10:36, and we'll be back online at 10:45. We'll be back at 10:45, quarter to 10 Colombian time. And therefore, please remain online. That now we're going to have the director of Altamira, of the Museum of Altamira, to show us one of the most amazing cave paintings of the European Higher Paleolithic. And later on, we're going to have Jamie Hamsong, that it's going to give a discussion about, it's going to make a discussion of all the presentations of the day and her reflections about that. And then we're going to go to the Q&A of the different panelists. And therefore, please stay here and we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Back. We're going back to our conferences. So I hope that you are enjoying this journey, global journey through early cave painting and not so early in other occasions, looking at differences between different places. We started with the Colombian Amazonia. Then we went to Asia. David Pierce, just before the break, told us about the prehistoric art in South Africa. Now we are moving to the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. And more specifically, we will be seeing research be made in Altamira. So I'm going to invite the director of the National Museum and Research Center in Altamira, Pilar Fatas Monforte, so that she can tell us about Altamira cave art and art, prehistoric art in Europe, the first art in humanity, let's say. So Pilar, I'm going to give you the floor so that you can share your presentation with us and tell us about the European Paleolithic art and especially the Altamira cave painting. Many thanks, Jose. I'm going to share my screen. There we are. And good morning all, good afternoon. According to the place you are and watching us and participate in this symposium. First of all, I want to thank the Colombian Institute of Anthropology and the Last Journey team for inviting me to participate in this very interesting international symposium and to talk about cave painting and prehistoric art, as Jose has just pointed out. Well, for those of you that are profane in this topic, and this first slide that I'm sharing with you here, this one, I will going to use it to explain to you how prehistoric art is a universal phenomena in time and space. Really, it is an artistic expression that is present between Homo sapiens and anatomically modern over 40,000 years ago to present day, because we still a native that have this phenomena that has the longevity in the history of humankind. And of course, an art that goes back 40,000 years. So this image that you see right now give us an idea because they represent 48 sites that have been included in the World Heritage of UNESCO, and that are sites that contain prehistoric art of different times. And as you can see, they're spread around the world. Now, if we concentrate in the European Paleolithic art, we can say that today we know over 400 sites from the south of the Iberian Peninsula up to the Ural Mountains in the European continent, and times that goes from the Pleistocene, the Upper Paleolithic, as we heard, that is about 40,000 years ago, and up to, let's say, 11,000 years ago. So right now we can say that we are talking of European cultural community because that have that common manifestation and, let's say, expressed by gatherers around Europe that have similar characteristics, very specific according to the region. And in Europe, we can say that the zone that shows more artistic expression is the Franco-Cantabric area. And that is exactly the area where the Altamira cave is located in the north of Spain, south of France. So this is an art of engraves and painted, mostly in inside caves, over walls, and isolated slabs and roofs, which some decades ago and after the entire prehistoric art was discovered in Europe, that were initially open air, but for the most part, they're found right now in caves that belong to this period in time and that are, let's say, expressed, as you can see here in our slide, they belong to Portugal, actually. So in 20-25 minutes, it's impossible to talk about the entire prehistoric art and Europe. As the main speaker presented, we are going to talk about the Altamira cave. So for the next few minutes, I will be talking about some of the elements that make of Altamira an international recognized site and is considered exceptional and very representative of this European Paleolithic art. So the first key, so to speak, is the mere discovery of it. Altamira Cave means that it was the prehistoric art was discovered with this cave. At that time, the archaeology that came about in the 19th century was just studying archaeological remains like stone pieces, bones, or they were characterized by the ways of the gatherers and hunters live at that time. And of course, some of them decorated with fine engravings and they were considered art. But until that moment, it was unknown of any figure painted or engraved in any cave whatsoever. So those were the places where the prehistoric people used to live. So in 1879, that person that you see, Marcelino Saustesola, was actually looking for archaeological remains in some locations, especially in this Altamira region in the north of Spain, when he found these paintings that I think it was a question of luck because so in that discovery, he was the first one who identified those paintings that belong to the same age of the archaeological objects and remains that were discovered until that time. And that was designated as Paleolithic. That is the first person that after an analysis conducted in 1880, he did an exhaustive analysis of both the archaeological material that he found as well as some indications that those are expressed that he identified that as prehistoric art or cave painting. We cannot explain right now the debate that gave place to, but if his theory was rejected, and it was only until 1902 where the French archaeologists found another caves that have the same of art that really associated that with the discovery made by Sans de Sautla. Of course, Marcelino, it didn't find any whatever cave with any prehistoric art there, but actually one of the most magnificent representation of Paleolithic prehistoric art. Like he couldn't actually believe his eyes when he saw that. But they were only considered primitive human beings at that time. So when we speak about Altamira art done by Homo sapiens and anatomically modern persons like us with the same capabilities as we have, and symbolism that were developed by him, by those people. Those symbolism was expressed in art that is part of the social environment that was represented here. So persons like us, as I said, that were actually hunters and gatherers that live from, let's say, what they were able to hunt or collect from the field. That this region was at that time very difficult, very different, sorry, from what we know of in landscape. It was populated by buffaloes, by other sort of wild animals that today we cannot imagine living there. So talking about the cave itself, it has about 300 meters in length, so to speak. The width varies between 6 meters to 20 meters, and in height between 2 meters and the lowest part up to 12 meters in the highest part. So it is a geology pretty simple, regular sort of flat roofs and walls with horizontal strata. And just to say that out of the 10 galleries that we have identified so far for research and prehistoric art, it is the fourth, the most significant one, the one that is most known international, because it's the room that hosts have these paintings here that I'm showing right now. And then this one, the number 10, at the very end of the cave, that is, we call the final gallery, where we have found significant manifestations that I will be showing you shortly. Now, when we speak about the different themes of Altamira, actually the European Paleolithic expression, with of course its differences in the regions and the fauna and the different times that those paintings were done. Actually, what we are saying is in Altamira, out of the more than 500 representations that we have identified so far, most of them show animals that we can recognize perfectly because they are represented in a very naturalistic way. Bisons, and here horses and deers, or here this goat and other animals similar to these. And let's say that the artists of the Paleolithic, they love their animals because they live with them. And so the representations, these naturalistic representations of the animals actually can be recognized and differentiate them. But even we can say that we can recognize behaviors of these different animals. And let's see some examples of this, especially about bisons that we are seeing here. For instance, animals that are shown with their legs folded under their bellies, and how they work very finely. This part of the leg here, the eyes, the horns. We also see them standing like this male. We can see that it's a male, and the alpha male of the pack is an adult animal, and we can see because of this development under his let's say near his belly, and this shape on top that is very prominent, and this and how the muscles are expressed here, both in the front as in the rear legs. So we can also see them in other latitudes, taking advantage of this outcrop of the rock. The artist took benefit of it to depict the animal looking backwards. Here we see the horns, this is the head, the eyes, the animal is lying down. And here we see the ear and how the animal turns his head and looks backwards. So, in respect to numbers, The second category that is most represented after animals are we are talking about signals. There are representations that don't have natural differentiation. In other words, we can identify them as an animal or man or whatever. They are just symbols. So we are trying to look for similarities where so far we haven't. They have different shapes and forms, but we cannot say that it cannot be referred to something natural. There are symbols that are stereotype, and we can classify them as that because they are shapes that repeat, and they repeat not only in one cave, like in here in Altamira, but they are repeated in many other caves in the north of Spain and the south of France that are, let's say, kilometers apart from each other. So that tell us that they have a meaning, a significance for them, but so far we don't have the Rosetta Stone in our hands to allow them to decipher what actually they mean, what is the real importance of these symbols for them, symbols of something. But today we cannot say any interpretation that we do is a mere hypothesis. So this is not that we can scientifically say it represents this or that. Now, the second category is the human representation. For human representation, we have the it's an element that is present in the 5 continents. I'm talking about the hands. That is the printing of the palm of the rock, or negative, that is leaving the print of the entire hand over the rock on negative form. And the other representations that we find in Altamira of humans is this one, anthropomorphic, and there are several of them in Altamira. We cannot say that they are human representations because they are a representation of several things, animals and humans in one. So they call them anthropomorphic because they have human features. Normally they are shown standing. This not the only one. In some cases, there are even hands depicted there, and some of them the hand showing upwards, and that's why we have called them the prayers. That's interpretation. And in that gallery of Altamira, we have very important representation, and that are the masks. This ones here, the artists or several artists using the shapes and forms of the rocks, and with some black traces here over here, they try to produce or reproduce a mask that have a kind of human and animal form, but it's pretty mysterious, and they're in the walls of the cave. Also, it's important, and looking at it from a naturalistic point of view, or how well represented are the animals, not so much for the human being, let's say, but but it has a meaning, a significance that we still don't understand, because persons that are so magnificent as artists, painters, and gravers, if they wanted, they could have actually produced kind of like a snapshot of their people that live with them, but that was not the case. So also in Altamira, for all European Paleolithic, we find all techniques, starting by engravings, that are being done with fingers, let's say, over, let's say, printings, like we see here. So this is the eye that I mean, this is a, and this engrave, or here done with a stone tool. We see here this female deer, and they have even represented the fur, the skin over it. Another one here that is depicted, the ear, the eye, and this tremendous horns over the head, and the rest of the body is properly, and this one uh, much deeper, let's say, but also paintings, drawings done with charcoal, I don't know, tool. And so we have this deer here with big horns, or this other one here that is being only an outline using red. Another deer here that is being drawn with very simple lines. And this head for bison with very using the drawing technique, very special, that we call that is like an outline of the main features of the head and eyes. Another one like this one, very good, very well expressed, the proportion of volumes. We have here the legs, the belly, and how the black is being used, and with different shades of some of them more darker than others. And finally, we have the painting. The painting with it's filled with color, like this horse, which kind of running, and it allows me to talk of overlapping, because the first one, it's a very ancient one, so to speak, and then later on, thousands of years after, perhaps, they paint over it and they added like some head next to it, and we can even identify the horn of that person. And polychrome paintings. Polychrome paintings, what they do is that they use all techniques, drawing and painting that they had at their disposition. First, they do an engraving over the rock, then they paint, draw in black, and they paint, they fill, let's say, with red color, and they painted it, they're called polygrams, because the artist, he did, what he incorporated the color to the color of the rock in the background, and leaving some portions without paint, like here, this is the natural color of the rock, so the rock becomes like in itself by a color. That's why I call polychrome. And I hope you can see here some detail. Look at the eye here. This profile here, it shows the fur, the skin. You can see the eye much better here in this picture. How good this representation is of this animal. And another example that I wanted to show you, and using the same technique, the polychrome, to represent, for instance, the leg folded, and leave some portion here where I painted the rear quarters, also partially paint, and not to lose the horn, because he's looking backwards, so they leave this contour without painted, so it can be highlighted, and it's part of the entire figure, providing kind of volume to the entire painting. And when we talk about volume and composition, those are also characteristics that are very well represented in Altamira. That is the incorporation of what we call support. Volumes are used as part of the overall composition, and this is a good example of that in Altamira. And this figure here, this crevice of the rock is what gives or provides the boundary, of the entire painting. This big volume that we can see here of the roof of this cave. This is special because it has some undulations and volumes that the artist took advantage of. So they're very special and gives a good idea of the incorporation of support, I mean, the shape of the contour of the rock as part of the art of the painting. These are tools and the charcoal from conifers, for instance, black, and pigments for the wreck. In other words, iron oxide for the teeth, all of them, the ones we have seen in the paintings we have found nearby, and this little kind of shells where they put the liquid pigment and another they put the mineral pigments. There's no evidence of them using like a glue to, let's say, to stick them or to the rock. In the Paleolithic, we have that big invention called air graphite with these little tubes that were made out of the bones of the animals, hollow, in a right angle shape, and they blew on one end. The pigment was inside, and when blowing, they applied the pigment of the color using this technique. And it's the only one from the Paleolithic time that we know so far. And it was discovered inside the Altamira cave and other exploration. We are talking here of over 20,000 years of prehistoric art, only about the polygrams, let's say. The oldest manifestation that we have found goes back to 30,000, 35,000 years. Is this one that is in the middle of that cave and red dye. And then we have another phase, very important one, from the set of red horses and hands, dots like we've seen here, that go back to 22,000 years. And the famous polychromes group that dated using a carbon 14, an age of 14,500 years attributed to them. And these ones that are being painted in black that go back to 12,000 years. And as from there, nothing, because the big opening of the Altamira cave, 15 meters wide, the Paleolithic, when the cave was, let's say, used and painted, and 12,000 years ago, so it collapsed. And that collapse meant that these magnificent manifestations were preserved in the last 12,000 years. What is their meaning? Is there a meaning? So I think the $1 million questions. As I said before, the historiography and researchers and primitive art have proposed different hypotheses in respect to the magic, or maybe paintings to propitiate a good hunting season, or maybe the structuralist, that is, in other words, looking for opposite meanings within a group of animals, and also other meanings. Something that we are thinking is that this could be an expression of their own ideas and thoughts, of their beliefs even. Why not? In other words, a symbolic expression of their entire world this is not a mere copy from the nature. There's a intentional selection of animals that were depicted, not all animals that were part of Mambalis, but a selection of the animals. There's no representation of vegetables, plants, or the landscape, nor reference to stars, or no, to the sky, only to animals. If all of that, we can say that there are symbols of something, and we don't have the code, of course, and therefore, for the time being, we cannot say more. So any interpretation that we can provide will be a mere hypothesis. And another thing it is that is something we can say is that it's social art. And that is that it has the meaning for the person who created, and has a meaning for community he lived in, of course. But that means that it is transcendental for them and for the artist. What is clear, it is that something that has a meaning. In this group where we see bitons, the excavations, what the archaeological remains tell us is that this artist that paint this use these animals because they represented something, deers and bisons here, and I insist that it's a theory that we hear around is something that we need to consider and be researched. So I have tried to explain all this experience and representations, and even the aesthetics that you have from the Paleolithic time. Think that deserve to be classified as a World Heritage, something that happened in 1985, and in 2008, this nomination of World Heritage was expanded to other 16 caves, all of them in the north of the Cantabric region in Spain. Center point, of course, is Altamira, but there are other caves around that they all together provide a context of what happened in the northern of Spain. And these are some representations of the same caves, and that's all of my part. Hope to see you in my museum. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pilar, for your excellent presentation. Wonderful details you show us about the painting, how the rock was used, the combination of colors and techniques is absolutely incredible and impressive. We are going to ask you to remain with us online because we have some questions that your presentation has
Okay, I'm going to give the floor to Jamie from Exeter. He's a specialist in cave art and in archaeological patrimony that it's going to tell us about the presentations that we've had today. Jamie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for this kind and warm invitation. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a few slides I've been typing away during the course of the last few hours. Hopefully you'll be able to see these. But before I actually talk through these slides, I should just say something about my background. Jose just mentioned that I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist, but I've also been working in recent years in particular on the heritage of rock art. And when we think about what is so important about these spectacular images. Yes, they're clearly beautiful and striking. We've seen that today. We've seen that from all different parts of the world. But why does any of this research matter? So much of this work has been done for many decades throughout different parts of the world,
and often in a colonial context. So we have to think about this, and I was pleased to hear the presenters, and especially in the introductions, about what this might mean for the indigenous people that are living in regions of Colombia and other parts of the world today. But the points that I was scribbling and typing in this first slide here refer to the themes that I thought came together from the speakers. And as I say, they were speakers from different parts of the world. It's always nice when you fundamentally agree with the main hypotheses that the previous speakers are making. And I had no surprises there. These are people who have specialized in rock art. They've thought carefully about this. This isn't just simple, pretty pictures. There's far more to it. But some of the questions that have been raised here, and some of the things that I think we need to be careful about wherever we work in the world, is acknowledging that, of course, there are differences between different bodies of rock art. Why would we expect anything different? But there are also similarities. So this came right up from this very controversial reference to the Sistine Chapel. I agree entirely. I think one of the problems with the sensationalism of referring to art as and as a comparison to the Sistine Chapel, the main problem with that, I think, is the Eurocentric approach and that kind of comparison. I think there is some validity in thinking of rock paintings as at least potentially being spiritual manifestations. And of course, we have to demonstrate this wherever we work in the world. And I was glad to see that that came through in all of the presentations. So there's a big difference here, perhaps, between European rock art research and rock art research in areas, in post-colonial areas of the globe, if you like. And obviously these are sensitive topics and they can be political topics. But my first point here is the fact that we have to demonstrate the differences as much as we have to demonstrate the similarities. This is a methodological point. And it's something that I learned in my first academic job when I was based at the University of the Witwatersrand. We heard from Professor David Pierce and the Rock Art Research Institute, and that was the first rock art I was involved in. And I learned that from a methodological point of view, that we have to think about whether we're lumpers or splitters when we're collecting data. We can't collect everything. And I like the point that several people made when they said, we've only got 20 minutes to cover a large area of the globe. Obviously, I've got 20 minutes to bring all these things together now. But when we go out into the field, there's an infinite number of data points that we could collect, but we're making selections. We haven't got time when we're in the field to record everything. I remember an anecdote when someone said, oh, we're recording the phases of the sun. We're looking at where the sun rises. Of course, context is important. And then someone rather cheekily said, but did you record the moon, the positioning of the moon? So there's always another level that you can go to. And this also applies to how we categorize rock art. And this came up in several of the talks. Do we just decide that we have three categories, perhaps: humans, animals, and then geometric patterns or signs? What about the ones that straddle those categories? What about how detailed should we go with the taxonomy of different animals? Come back to this later, because it's obviously and something that we'll learn about tomorrow. Were these distinctions important to the original indigenous artists who created the rock art? That's a tricky question. So the second point here is that interdisciplinary approaches are key. And this seems obvious, but I'm glad that Jose and others stressed this. We can look at this from an anthropological point of view. I think it's very important that we do, especially in post-colonial contexts. Let's speak to the descendants of the original artists. Again, it seems obvious now, but it's amazing how many early researchers didn't bother. Of course, we can look at it from the archaeological point of view, and Jose explained that in the team with the ERC grant, the zooarchaeology, the bioarchaeology, and so on. There's work that can be done with genetics here as well as geography, art history. Pilar just talked about this, talked about aesthetics, and I'll come to this in a short while. Art historians used to be the authorities on ancient rock art, and that could cause problems. So another key point is, what questions should we be asking? Again, Pilar and others talked about this. Andres mentioned this when he talked about the ethnography and bringing up ideas of meaning and what this means, or even the motivation for creating rock art. Yes, it's the million-dollar question. Should we at least try to answer those questions or even ask them? For so long, people did little other than describe, which I think is a rather nihilistic approach. Yes, it's the safest way of doing it, but if we want to make progress, especially when there are descendants of the original artists that we can talk to. So we're aiming to get at the essence of the art, perhaps. Meaning is a very difficult question. I think I'll leave that aside for now. Perhaps it'll come up in the questions and I'll pass the buck. But I think one thing we do need to remember is that in many indigenous contexts, hunter-gatherer groups and descendants of hunter-gatherer groups talk about the images as being powerful things in themselves. And this comes through in the ethnography of South America, which I'm not an expert on, but I've read a lot on ethnographic analogy. And perhaps this will come up tomorrow when we specialize in South American paintings. Reichel Dolomitov, and controversial in some ways, but again, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So many indigenous groups talk about the images themselves being powerful and having agency. The pigments themselves were considered sacred, if you like. And this argues against this third point, which again is a cautionary tale. And again, I think this was covered nicely in that, of course, we need to look at context. We need to look at what is around the rocks. It's a question of scale. We don't just zoom in on the panels, although that's very important to stare and look at these, preferably for weeks and weeks, and record them in whatever way is appropriate. But we need to think about the surrounding landscape, the proximity of rivers, yes, but we also have to be careful to think, well, is this the primary reason that the artists were choosing to paint on this rock face? It's very hard to demonstrate. So we have to look at context and scale. And we also have to beware from a Western point of view, or beware the Western point of view of aesthetics. A lot of these groups may have different approaches to aesthetics. The techniques that we use to create the art, whether they were engravings or paintings, for example, might not have had huge significance or any significance to the original artists. About the idea that this might have been more about the process of creating the art rather than the product. So the images I've shown here, I've just sort of pulled up. The bottom left one you probably recognize, especially the South American specialist. I put it there because it was one of the first sort of images I saw before I became a specialist in rock art, if you like. And I thought that is stunningly beautiful. And it obviously begs questions about whose hands these were and what is going on. So yes, these images are beautiful, but there's a lot of other questions we can ask. Top right is an image from West Texas, where I've done a lot of my research. Again, a spiritual being peering through from behind the rock's surface. We know this from ethnography. It's not just a pretty picture, and it's not just a mask in inverted commas. That's a rather too simplistic term. And of course, bottom right, which is was in Pilar's show as well, from the famous French cave, just to show that there are caves being made in discoveries being made in Europe, even in recent times too. So I need to get a move on, but I just wanted to put a few more ideas up here. And these were a few slides that I had ready before I heard the talks. But this first one, which is a cartoon from the Guardian newspaper in the UK, And Berger and Wise are very clever cartoonists, and they ask probing questions. But it took me a while to spot this chap here on the right-hand side of the screen at first. And even though Berger and Wise acknowledge that there's more to rock art than just pictures of a menu or nice things to eat, they came up with this cartoon, sort of again, and it probably doesn't help us to get away from the fact that a lot of people more in the public, if I can use that term, and people who might not be as might have looked at the symbolism behind rock art, get away from this idea that rock paintings are just depictions of things that are good to eat. And all of the speakers made this point today. This is about symbolism. These are deeply things in themselves. So this isn't just a fast food restaurant. The Banksy image I like because it's a different kind of cartoon, and it really gets people thinking about heritage, protection of sites. Why does this matter? And it's something I often show my students to say, not just to say that, you know, I've got my finger on the pulse of youth culture, but to think about these issues and why rock art might be important today. Other parts of the world where I've worked include other states in the Western United States of America, but this, I suppose, is a warning again to say that the images here aren't just reflections of what's out there in the real world. Here's this wonderful Thunderbird motif, which we know from an animistic cosmology and animistic ontological point of view that this was one of the grandfathers. This was a spiritual being that flew through the sky, often in the spring, firing lightning and bringing thunder. And this is to explain that there is an interdigitation of the spiritual and the mundane worlds, something that Andrzej underscored with his presentation. But also it's a warning that we should be careful about just the size of images, meaning they're important. And David Pearce made this point. The Thunderbird is huge here, yes. Some of these dancing figures here are much smaller than the Thunderbird. That doesn't necessarily mean they're less important. We're also seeing this layering, this superpositioning that, that all the presenters refer to in one way or another. And this doesn't necessarily a disrespectful reclaiming of a space. Often this is about drawing from the potency of art that was already on these rock walls. There are also pigment smears around this hole here. It's not hard, it's not easy to see in this image. In fact, it's impossible to see, but please take my word for it. And again, that we need to think here from an aesthetic point of view. Why were they doing that? Using ethnographic analogy, there's a fairly good hypothesis to suggest that there was some interaction with the rock face and possibly the spirit world behind. So when Pilar talked about the artists in Altamira interacting with the rock face, here's another example of the importance of context. Creatures that are impaled. There are surprisingly few depictions of so-called hunting scenes, certainly in Western United States, and indeed lots of other parts of the world. So if this was a reflection of what people were doing, why aren't we seeing far more of these? We know that the people hunted animals, and a point that several speakers made was the images are culturally selected, not just a question of there are X amount of animals out there in the real world, so we'll reproduce that many in the rock or in the caves or on the boulders. There is always a cultural selection going on. Here we've got a possible human-animal crossover. It's a bighorn sheep, and several researchers have specialized in this. Very unusual feet, possibly human-like feet. So again, blurring the boundaries between humans and animals was something that was universal, or should I say near universal. So we have to demonstrate again the differences as well as the similarities. Okay, I've got a few more slides, so bear with me. A few from Australia. So as well as the United States and Africa, I was lucky enough to be based in Western Australia for 4 years and worked with various Aboriginal groups in the northwest of Australia and the Northern Territory. And these amazing pictures are from the Northern Territory. Again, I should add here as an aside that this was something I learned in South Africa when I was told by various people that when you are lucky enough to go around the world and you see all this amazing rock art, people will always imply that their rock art is the best. That normally means the most aesthetically striking in a Western sense. So one learns to be diplomatic and say it's among the best that I've seen. That said, we are going to see some truly spectacular images in tomorrow's talks. The other point is about the competition about who's got the oldest. And this came up various speakers today. It might not have mattered to the indigenous groups. Indigenous groups, again, I've been careful not to homogenize and oversimplify, but many indigenous groups that I've worked with have said, well, we don't really care about that. We've always been here, so let's just move on. In some cases, though, it is helpful, and this often involves going into a court of law and acting as the specialist and pointing out that, in fact, these paintings are a number of years old. Some of the Majabebe paintings that, in the Northern Territory are probably 60,000 years old. It's a pretty good way of demonstrating that indigenous groups, in this case Aboriginal groups, have lived in this area for a long time. And some of these sites have been discovered, or rather rediscovered, recently. And the images at the top are obviously a very recent European settlers, the classic hands on hips pose, the rifle, and the pipe. You see similar depictions all over the world. And yes, I think I'll leave it there for the Australian sites. Apart from to bring the heritage aspect here into this, and again, this is political. Some people aren't always the most comfortable about this, but there are issues everywhere in the world. And the point about rock art being part of social production and of spiritual significance, obviously, is that it truly affects groups today. This is about negotiating identity. It's not always comfortable. So I'll let you read the quote there from Ros Langford. It became famous in Australian academia and Australia at large because so much of this is about ownership. Who owns this heritage, this rock art? And what right do we have? And of course, it's a difficult question to answer. What are we hoping to achieve? Again, this is why some people think we should just be describing a rock art. And so much of this is obviously about common courtesy, collaboration. The billabong here is actually the result of mining quarries, tailings. So what looks beautiful and peaceful and wonderful at first glance has actually got something more to it. And we've heard the word hypothesis several times today. Yes, this is about testing hypotheses, and we should accept different hypotheses, but some are more compelling than others, and some are more egregious than others. I don't think it helps Aboriginal people when their art is often ascribed to alien invasion, as we see here. These are based on fantastic Wandjina figures in the north of Australia. We know who painted them. They were Aboriginal groups. You can speak to the families of the individual artists today. There's this tendency to ascribe things we don't know to aliens or perhaps early mysterious white settlers, such as the Phoenicians. We find this in Southern Africa, Great Zimbabwe, for example. So there's another bigger question here about why does this matter? We also have to deal with the horrific vandalism. And that was the point that was made right at the start about spectacular rock art of La Lindosa area. I'm going to skip ahead now. I'm going to leave some of I had some slides from India. If anyone is really keen, you can email me. But it was really looking, drawing from what Andrzej had said about contemporary use of art and how it's used by people today, whether they're descendants of the original artists or not. Is this appropriation? When something's recontextualized, we have to think about the maintenance of identities and the challenging of identities. There are economic implications here. So we can look at rock art through time. We can look at the recent manipulation of rock art. Until recently, many Aboriginal groups were still painting. They were freshening up the paintings in sites that their ancestors had been painting for many years, many generations. They talk about renewing the health of the country, keeping the country healthy, country meaning the area where these groups would live. So again, it's just pointing out here that this is rock art's important. It seems obvious, and I think I'm sort of preaching to the converted, preaching to the choir here. It does have an active role to play in the negotiation of socio-political identities. It is used as a mediator between Western, for want of a better word, and indigenous legal systems. And this is rather mischievous, partly because Andrzej and I have just put this book out, so it's a bit of a shameless plug, but it did just come out on Monday, so I couldn't resist. Apologies. But again, it's looking at the ancient art that goes back tens of thousands of years and how it has been recontextualized today and explaining why this might matter. And my final point is that, thankfully that things are changing. We very rarely see books like this now on the bottom left, which is again is this rather Eurocentric idea, partly because most of the first discoveries were made by Europeans and most of the first universities were in Western Europe. But this isn't a teleological grand narrative progression from these ancient cave paintings to Western Renaissance artists and people like Picasso and if you like, to Banksy. There's more to it than that. There was huge sophistication right from the start. We've seen that in the beautiful images that we've been lucky enough to look at today. And also the problem with books like this is that very often in a 200-page book, there might be 3 or 4 pages on the first 100,000 years of human artistic expression and the essential artistic and spiritual beliefs. And then the rest of the book, the remaining 197 pages on what happened in Europe in the last 300-400 years. So I hope that I've managed to bring together some of the themes, and I hope that I've managed to provocatively ask a few questions that people might like to mull over and then hopefully direct, not to me, but to some of the previous speakers, and they can see what they can do with them. So finally, thank you to the translators and all the technical support, and to Jose and all of the team in South America, and indeed up the road here in Exeter. So thank you all very much.
Okay, many thanks, Jamie, for your reflections. The truth is that you have put a contextual and theoretic framework to the rock art, and beyond the excellent descriptions that we have had today about rock art around the world, and no doubt they're pretty relevant. Okay, now let's go to our Q&A session, and I'm going to direct the questions to the different speakers. We are going to follow the order of appearance, so to speak, of the speakers, and we have received. The first question is for us, for a group, and Rafael Suarez, a colleague and a friend of ours from Uruguay, he's asking if there's evidence or bifacial artifacts in places where there have been excavations and about, let's say, 12,000 years ago in La Lindosa in Colombia. And what relationship do they have with the location suggested by Dr. Heneco in Cauca region, and if they relate to each other? So, Rafael, I think it's very interesting question, pertinent. Um, Unfortunately, Javier Aceituno, the person who has carried out the analysis of different artifacts found in La Lindosa, it's traveling and he can answer your question, but I'm going to answer that for you. First of all, I want to tell you that the lithic industry, rocks that we have been recovering from the lower levels, so the oldest ones in La Lindosa, it's unifacial, uniface, expected, and we have not recovered artifacts that are bifacial. They don't seem to have connection with our other early expressions of bifacial in Colombia or even the rest of South America. It is also it represents very little instruments, and Javier talks about microlithism or micro rocks, which is similar to these agri-locations that Cristobal Joneco proposed. What we see in La Lindosa, and as Caspar highlighted, once our first groups arrived to the Amazonia, and they were exploiting an endless number of resources, vegetable resources that exist there. If I remember well, there are even 13 different palm tree species that are being exploited at the oldest levels. So compared to the locations that Cristobal Joneco proposes, is a different environment altogether, because there is tropical rainforest and forests of the upper mountains, and what has of similarity is the big variety of plants that are being experienced from very early times. And these groups are not hunters, specialized gatherers, but rather they have an economy that is, we can call general economy. And they are taking benefit of all resources they can find around in the forest from the very first time. And La Lindosa, in that respect, and as Gaspar also highlighted, it's a mosaic that combine at that time, savanna with rivers and lagoons and marshlands associated to the rivers. We have plenty of aquatic resources. Also, a very special geologic formation, such as the Precambric shield that is, let's say, formed as flat hills of Precambric origin, and forests that are highly dominated by palm trees. So areas that could have been very attractive for these early hunters and gatherers. So to end, and different from these agro locations that Cristobal Joneco proposed, at least in rock, we haven't recorded nor tools, and very little elements to process vegetables. So that made us to think that probably they have technology to process all these plants that they were consuming that were made out of wood. So yes, in terms of economy, as I said before, is a general widespread economy, similar to the agro locations of Carlos Henico. I wouldn't say that agri is actually farming. We are talking here about mostly about hunters and gatherers. They are gathering wild plants that are just beginning to farm or to plant the first species of plant that we find in the late Holocene in the Amazon. But that is, as I said, it's a general economy. So Rafael, I hope I answered your question. Now then, I'm going to ask now to Andrek. It comes from our audience, Jason Chaparro, a student that has been helping and working very hard with our group. He has asked us and talking, yeah, about the $1 million question. This is for Professor Andres from Siberia. Very hypothetical, but something that we all have in mind. And we who saw your presentation about rock art in Siberia, we are making that kind of question. As you perhaps know, André, in all genetic studies are aiming at showing that the human origin that populated the Americas have a common origin. I mean, in Siberia, with Siberia. So the question is, if you see any sort of correlation between rock art of Siberia and rock art in the Americas, can you conclude that there are some traditions and signs that rock art in Siberia, some of them is reflected in the Americas? So the question is for you, André.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas.
Actually, it's a huge question, and it's very complicated. As far as I know, until now, there was no any serious research on rock art from the perspective of comparing two continents, America and Asia. And of course, there are some similarities. And there was, as far as I know, there was from Russian side, there were investigations from the point of view of mythology, from the point of beliefs. And Yuri Bereskin from St. Petersburg was probably one of the leading researchers who was involved in comparative studies between American beliefs and North Asian beliefs. And concerning the art, it's I think it's still the topic for a very big new project. I can say from my personal perspective that I can see some similarities between some images between North America and Siberia. And what is furthermore interesting, that this similarities concern not very, very old representations, but rather from second, third, first millennium BC. This is some stylistic analogies can be found between first millennium BC representation in Siberia and these images which we can find in the British Columbia in North America, in Canada. This is I know that there is genetics studies, and it's yes, it's clear, but I think that it's still the topic for the huge new project for investigation, for joining researchers from different continents. And actually in Siberia, people, archaeologists, I think they were most and still are most concerned on the investigation of the art from local perspective. And maybe it's the question of opening new windows, new doors for communication between different sides. These areas are not so easy for investigation. and concerning the far east of Siberia, and concerning the Alaska and other parts of North America. And as far as I know, there are very little some kind of comparisons between motifs, but not any serious research. I can say that I can just to refer to maybe one interesting element which can be inspiration for other people as well. I would like to refer to this study of David Whitley, North American rock art researcher from California. And we were talking many times, quite often, about relationships between Siberia and North America. And in one of his books, he presented very surprising hypothesis basing on these conclusions coming from Siberia, that it's quite difficult to find shamanistic images which are very old. And he proposed a hypothesis that maybe shamanism originated in America and was brought in not very old times to Siberia, to North Asia, and the origins of Siberian shamanism should be looked for, should be searched for in North America. But it's still very hypothetical, but very thought-provoking. And one of the images which I showed you also in my presentation from the burials, which are very untypical, not typical for Siberian art traditions. I remember when I was discussing these images with archaeologists in North America, and I asked them, how do you think where do they come from? And they were sure they are from America. When I said them that they are from Siberia, they were very much surprised. So I think there are some elements which are very stimulating for developing the research from this perspective. But I would say it's still the challenge for future, for huge research project. I'm not sure if I was heard.
Thank you. Yeah, many thanks, Andre, for your answer. Now, we have a couple of questions, more specific, let's say, that a couple of participants made. Gisela Cubillos, she says, good morning. Where do you take reference, shamanic reference, allow
Okay, thank you. I can see these questions in the chat. So thank you for this question. The answer is very simple and very short. We have a very good ethnography about it. Ethnographical documentations from the country. So there is it's very well described. And I don't know what to say more. I can make references, to send references to literature, to articles which describe this phenomena.
Thank you very much. Now, next question. I was interested to an image that you show of rock art from Yenisei medium. It's one in Ankara style, categorized in the rock age in your chronology, and it represents a boat or a canoe or some sort of vessel with 10 persons standing over it and something on top. So I study early navigation and sailing and traditional vessels and boats. And I think, first of all, if that was dated and where it was found. Besides, I would like to know if there are more representations of boats and canoes in your area of study. Is this a common topic in rock art in Siberia?
Okay, thank you. Actually, there are more images of boats in different parts of Siberia. And I just already communicated with the person who asked this question. I will be very glad to send some references to the information, to the papers which describe this phenomena from Siberian point of view. Of course, the precise dating is still very complicated. Based on some kind of associations between different animals, different images. It can be suggested that maybe the oldest come from the Neolithic period. And this is also maybe not so much surprising that these images are located mostly just on the cliffs nearby the rivers. So it can be connected with the movement, the transportation. It can be also connected with kind of mythological ideas, because the boat is also conceptualized in the Siberian mythologies as a kind of vehicle which is transforming you to the other world. So there were also research on these images from this mythological perspective as well. And images of boats can be found in different parts of Siberia, in this area on the upper Yenisei River as well, but even in the north, in the Kamchatka, Chukotka area. So there are also images of boats. It could be very tempting, of course, to link them with the travels to other continent, but I wouldn't like to go to so far. It's just very quickly.
Thank you. Dr. Andre, one more question from Rafael Miviera from Brazil. And he asks you, from the indigenous point of view, the shamans are like diplomats, like have an influence on different worlds, and they assume different bodies, sometimes animals or sometimes humans. Now, you have said that normally you find shamans in the images of Siberia, not that often, but Rafael asks you, do you consider the possibility that these persons, the shamans, can be represented in animal bodies, which lead me to think that the images should represent also the rituals of the shamans in the body of those animals?
Yes, yes, of course. It was very little time to talk about this, but definitely, if we look at transformations which are in the background of shamanic experience, so the animals are very, very important. And even if we refer to the drums, which I discussed very shortly, we have also images in Siberian rock art of the human, where the humans are standing on animals. So it could be also looked also from this perspective, from the symbolic perspective, that the human is riding on the animal, and the animal was then transformed into the drum. But of course, it's still the question for investigation, but of course, the interrelationships, identification of the human with the animal is a very important aspect of shamanic experience. And this is particularly interesting to study from the perspective of this art where we have this some kind of a hybrid beings, half human, half animal, which are quite common in different parts of Siberia in different chronological moments. So yes, it's still interesting topic for and the way of investigating and identifying shamanism also in rock art iconography.
Okay, we are going to continue with other questions from the audience. And we're not going to follow an order. There are a couple of questions for Jamie Hansen. And the first question for Jamie comes from Mr. Martinez, and it's a question, it's a challenging question, and it's a question that goes to the heart of cave art, and in certain sense, we're talking about art. And therefore, Jamie, let's see if I can ask you the question in a very clear manner. Victor Martinez asks, how real would we have to think that spiritual things are, or why the spiritual things are not real? From what reality landscape it's this enunciated? Thanks about your reflection.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a very good question, and I probably should have clarified what I meant by the word real. I was using it in the Western sense of what is actually out there in the so-called real world. But of course, in any group, not just indigenous groups or in post-colonial situations, excuse me, in the so-called Western world as well, we think things in our heads and we see images, and they are very real to us. But I think the important thing here is getting away from one of the main problems, as I see it, in rock art research for perhaps 100 years, before people really started taking the ethnography seriously, or indeed speaking with the indigenous groups. People were determined just to see the images as reflections of everyday life and nothing more. And it takes away, or has the danger of taking away, the complexity and the sophistication of the minds of the original artists. So it isn't used in a pejorative way at all. It's a very good question, and it's actually similar to one that I just answered typing about the difference between thinking about an animal or thinking something in our heads and as opposed to seeing it. So yes, we do see things in our heads, but it's a point that I think all the presenters made about the selection of what goes onto the rock face. If it was just a question of what we were seeing, we would see depictions of landscapes. Pilar made that point. There are so few depictions of landscapes, horizon lines, or even plants. That's why it's always very exciting when there are images of plants. Why are there so many more depictions of animals and humans than plants? So yes, thank you for asking the question, and I hope that clarified it, at least to some extent.
Okay, thank you so much, Jamie. And as a matter of fact, it's very important that we're going to cover briefly tomorrow in La Lindosa. It's so relevant to see how La Lindosa and in general the Amazonian area, it's an area where we have more representations of plants, where we would say that the first migrants to these areas started to use all the resources, all the vegetable resources, and they also depict plants. They are not as depicted as animals, but they are depicting many of the plants. And therefore, we're going to continue with you, Jamie. And we have a question from Guillermo Munoz that he is asking. I would like that Dr. Hamsung would talk a bit more about the way in which cave art, it's the result of what the authors think and not what they see, and the way in which other groups build additional versions.
Thank you, and thank you again for the question. I think I've answered the first in terms of the difference between thinking and seeing. And of course, this is about terminology, and it's the division of the so-called rational mind that we use in the Western world, going back to Descartes and before. And of course, again, without oversimplifying, so many different groups would not necessarily separate the spiritual from the mundane. Or indeed this sense of what is and isn't real, or what is and isn't important. But again, it's trying to get away from the old approach, which is this is just reflecting what's out there. I think when we hear about the plants tomorrow, hopefully we'll hear about which plants were depicted. And also it's this idea of agency. It's not just cultural selection, but why were some things represented and not others? It's the word reflection in itself is problematic, because we know that lots of groups talked about these images being spiritually important in themselves. They had agency. Whether we believe it or not is a different matter. The second part of the question is a great question. And again, this needs to be demonstrated in wherever we work. But we know from the ethnography in Southern Africa, for example, that groups that came along later, later than the San people that David Pearce was talking about, the Khoisan groups, and even more recent agricultural groups, farming groups, would co-opt the earlier images. They would draw power from them. There are a few references to this, and indeed in some North American rock art. Groups would actually chip away the older pigment in these sacred spaces, and the new arrivals would know that these spaces were sacred. There might have been a more harmonious relationship between the groups than we would have suspected. So it isn't necessarily vandalism when someone paints over the top of someone else's artwork, or even chips the pigment away to use it as some kind of medicine. So there are different types of appropriation. And again, this isn't just sort of jumping on the bandwagon and paying lip service to decolonization or cultural appropriation. Of course, we've got to be careful of that. But some appropriations are more insulting than others. And of course, it's a very political point, and it's very tricky. A lot of it is about respect, and we have to take each case on a case-by-case basis. So there's more work to be done on superpositioning in general, and to look at the difference of different layers, and even trying to work out the dates of how many years elapsed between the oldest layer of paint and the second oldest. And in the case of Australian caves where I've been lucky enough to work, we know that there are 10 or even 12 layers of pigment superimposed upon one another, probably going back tens of thousands of years. It's very hard to demonstrate. So again, I hope that at least gets to some of the heart of the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a clarifying statement. Thank you. I would like to ask a question to Pilar Fatas, and it's about that cave art, as we have said, has a lot of regional varieties. And as we hope that it's clear tomorrow when we see the differences of cave art in the Amazon region, and we can see how the difference from the Lindosa mountain range and also in Chiribiquete in the national park, I think that cave art in the Paleolithic, in the higher Paleolithic, also shows a very significant regional diversification. And that's why it's called my attention, and to make a comparison, a very simple comparison and almost anecdotal between what can be the variety of animals that we can see in Altamira with other animals or other places that I know because my family is from the region, as the Ecain cave in the Basque region, when we only see horses depicted. And I know it's a hard question, and even it ranges into speculation if she can have some ideas of why in some caves like Ecain, we only have horses depicted and there's a lesser diversity of animals. Okay, thank you. It's a very difficult question. We can say in Ecain we have other representation of other animals, but I think that the most significant animal, it's the horse. And this is what happens. We see that in Altamira there's a diversity of animals, but we can see since a very specific moment that we call the main representation is of the buffalo, of the bison, and we can see that that's most significant area. And as we can said in that period that we called we can see that the polychromes were also covered by horses, and especially we can say that we did a variety of animals. However, we have to take into account the different timelines where this is done. Therefore, we talk about buffaloes or bisons. We talk about horses in the Gravitans, and the Cain, basically the representations are the horses are depicted, and they are magnificent depictions of horses, and it's also part of the World Heritage. And making an interpretation, it's very difficult. It's also very associated about what they wanted to tell us, because for them, the horse in Ecain, the bison in Altamira, all of them are very similar timelines. And because that's a very moment of the Paleolithic cave art in the area of the Cantabria, for them that animal was so important. It's to say it's not just to represent the horses in the landscape, and they have a value behind, and the presentations that we have seen and in Siberia, that we can see that there is a power behind that animal because that community gives it that value. However, that we can see that part of European Paleolithic cave art, it's very difficult to make analogies because they're so apart in time. But yes, of course, there's a value behind the representation of that animal. And what I wanted to say is that the horse is a symbol. And this is what I wanted to say about interpretation, that we talk about symbols, and we talk about the bison clan, the horse clan, etc. But of course, there are other significant qualities that we call them like sanctuaries. And they can be very special places, special places. These are special places where people could gather and that would live around this caves, and that they were special places for holding myths and rites, and for the transmission of their beliefs, and also for several social regions. Why the horse in Negrain? Well, I don't know. Why the bison in Altamira? We don't know. But especially that animal, they would give it a value beyond what the animal itself was. And of course, it's part of that interpretation that it's difficult. And I do believe that in Australia and even in America, well, whenever there are indigenous populations that show this art, or sometimes for analogies, it's easier. And also in the Paleolithic areas, because 10,000 years have gone by, because that's why I see that these are different, these are just these are just ramblings, but it's very difficult that, we need the registrations of cave art. I don't know if I answered your question. Thank you so much, Pilar. Okay, well, we expect from another question from the attendees more than a question. I have a question for David Pierce. I would like to ask him the fact that he has done a magnificent presentation about the cave art, that I think that it's dated from the Middle Holocene to the Late Holocene. And I would like to be, say I'm an ignorant about this point, and also I would like to ask you if there is a relationship between this cave art that he presented from the Late Holocene to earlier expressions or earlier depictions in the South Africa or in the African region. Or do you think that this is a phenomenon that arises in an independent manner in South Africa during the onset of the Late Holocene?
Thank you. I think that's it's quite a difficult question to answer in a lot of ways, partly because of the lack of chronology. The kind of hunter-gatherer art I was speaking about, art broadly similar to that, occurs across southern Africa, south of the Zambezi River. So that's Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, southern parts of Mozambique. So it's a very large area, and we've got overall very little idea of the dating of that art. The earliest evidence, the secured date we have for any art is in Namibia, where a painted slab was buried in a deposit and then dated by association from that deposit. And that dates to 27,000 years ago. So this art tradition in the broad region clearly is older than what we've seen or we've been able to demonstrate in the Drakensberg alone. But as I said, there are only really a handful of dates across a very vast region, and that we can get any secure idea of the age from. But I think it is quite an important question, in that South Africa is one of the places where the debates about the origins of art and the origins of modern humanity is being played out, particularly in a number of our southern coastal sites. And there's a whole range of materials that people are arguing about whether they are art or not, and so on. So at about 100,000 years ago, there's evidence of liquid paint. We don't know what they're doing with it. People are engraving patterns on ostrich eggshells at about 100,000 years ago. 77,000 years ago, we've got geometric patterns engraved on ochre blocks, and so on. So there's a whole load of these things in this very early period that are some kinds of representations. What exactly they are and what they mean, we don't know. But there's no direct link that we can make between those early representations and the much later hunter-gatherer art, or certainly not at this point. We find coloring materials throughout the sequence, from these very early dates right through to very recent contexts, so ochres particularly, but other things as well. But we don't know what they're doing with those coloring materials. It may be a factor of preservation. A lot of the sites I was showing you are in a very soft sandstone context, and it may simply be that the art doesn't last that long in this region. But we don't really have much that links the very early stuff that people are arguing about in terms of the origins of modern humanity and origins of art to the art I was speaking about.
Okay, thank you so much, David. Another question that we would like to ask you, David, it's the relationship between what has been painted and what's in the menu of these hunters gatherers. I imagine that you've done excavations on these sites where there is a cave art, and I would like to ask you if in the menu of the hunters gatherers we see all the animals that have been painted, or for example, there is some animals that have been represented in a cave art, but that there has been a certain of taboo in the diet.
Right, that's also a really interesting point with this art. As you would have seen, most of the animals, certainly in the Drakensberg, are quite large ungulates. The eland, particularly, there are a great many depictions of, and it's a very large antelope, sort of oxen sort of size. They're the most common. There's some smaller antelope as well, but predominantly those large antelope that we see painted in the Drakensberg region. In other parts of southern Africa, there's a much wider range of animals depicted, but also predominantly large ungulates, large antelope, that sort of thing. When we look at what people are eating, it's really quite different. People are eating an awful lot of plant foods, and that varies from area to area. There are a lot of bulbs and corms and underground sort of plant storage organs that are used. People are using a lot of grass seeds that have been collected and ground up. So plant foods are a really important component of people's diet, and we don't see that at all in this region. There are almost no paintings of plants at all. In South Africa, certainly. In Zimbabwe, in the art in that region, there are quite a lot of depictions of plants, but probably not the plants people are eating. In terms of animals, people certainly do eat these large animals. People eat eland. They are represented in the faunal assemblages, as are pretty much everything that's available. But they certainly don't dominate it. The majority of animals that are being eaten are very small. Most frequently found thing in a lot of cases is the rock hyrax, which is about the size of a large rabbit, and occurs in all these mountainous areas. There are quite a lot of small antelope, the sorts of things that can be snared. There are relatively few large animals represented in most of these assemblages. So people are certainly not painting what they were eating. It's not a painting of the menu by any means. I don't think there were taboos about eating a lot of these animals. I think it's just that it's quite difficult to get them, and it's a lot easier to get a lot of the smaller animals in terms of the food. But painting-wise, there's a very definite selection of a very small group of animals that are painted frequently, and then a handful of things that are painted less frequently.
Many thanks, David. Okay, let's wait a few more minutes to see if more questions come from our participants. There are some questions about how the heritage is being handled in the area of La Lindosa and the Colombian Amazonia. So I think that is a topic to be discussed tomorrow. We have 4 presentations tomorrow about that area, and all authors will be reflecting about that. And so that's better for tomorrow. Let's see, there are more questions from our audience. Let's wait for a minute or two. Okay. So let's start closing today's session. I think it has been a first day of a very productive symposium. Personally, I have learned a lot throughout this global journey of rock art, cave painting. I think is going to help us a lot to think more and to be able to put in context and compare with the, let's say, rock art in Latin America and Colombian Amazonia with that exists in other parts of the world. So without further ado, I'm going to share sorry for that. I have a little problem here sharing my screen. Okay, here we are. Now I'm sharing my screen with you. I think it's okay. I want to invite you for tomorrow. Tomorrow, 18 June, we will be here 9 a.m. to start. We will be traveling, as we see here in this image, throughout the early rock art that exists in South America. We're going to start that journey in Colombia, talking about La Lindosa. And after that, we will have there for Professor Fernando Ordina with us, talking about the European presence and they invaded. And then we will move to the Chibiriquete National Park, Carlos Castaño Uribe and Carlos Laza Alcalá will be talking about the rock art in the Colombian Amazonia, seen from the Chibiriquete point of view, perspective. There will be doing a reconstruction of biodiversity as from observations in Chibiriquete and extinct archaeofauna and current fauna. After that, we'll be going to the northeast part of Vichada. Natalia Lozada will be showing us rock art recently discovered. And that is a kind of a breaking news, this symposium. And after that, we will be traveling to another part of the continent in the lower part of the Amazon. In other words, the Piedra Pintada cave. We will be having two presentations on that, but one by Christopher Sean Davis. We'll be talking about tradition, astronomic and pictographies and late Pleistocene. And after that, Edith Pereira and Clara Morales talking about rock art in Monte Alegre, characteristics and archaeological context. Recently, this couple of researchers, the West University, the University of West Paraná, have been studying Caverna Pintada, and they will be bringing us with fresh news about this couple of sites. After that, we will travel to the middle, the center of Brazil, Ander Cruz and Aninísio Baeta will be making a summary about rock art in the center of Brazil, Minas Gerais, and we will be ending in the northeast of Argentina and Patagonia. Laura Miotti and Natalia Cárdenas will be making a summary of early rock art in these two regions of Argentina. And to end, we will have contemporary artists, Nilson Manicua from the Amazon region, who will be talking to the memory, that is the ethnographic analogy of indigenous communities. And they have kind of last word in the interpretation of rock art. And they were talking about the territory of memories, history of the Amazon ideal. And to end, and talking about pleasures, we will have Eduardo Goiz Neves, actually. We can say that he is is a leader in Amazon archaeology from São Paulo University, and he will be making a comment about the totality of presentations. And we will end, of course, with our Q&A session. So I encourage you who are here with us in this Zoom gathering, as well as those of you who are following us in YouTube, both in Portuguese as in Spanish, to step in and make questions to our different speakers about interesting topics. So, and I think that having said that, we conclude our session of today. I hope you have a happy day, a good night for those of you that are in Europe. Good afternoon for us here in the Western Hemisphere. I hope we have tomorrow a productive session as the one we have had today. Good to see you.